Well, now that we've got the wood color more or less matching again, comes time to decide what we're going to do between these areas of the traces and the areas of the background of the checkering, which I would like to retain. I'm going to use a grooving tool and just go ahead and outline that back to the factory outline. If you'll notice, all the Lichtenberg figures fall within that, and that was the whole point of doing them the way we did them, was to make them fall out that way. So to do that, rather than trying to checker and stop and start and stop and start amongst all those little traces, I'm going to do what's called stippling, and I spoke about stippling more in the video on the forehand, but essentially stippling is a random series of punches or sharp indentations in the material to provide a grip or to provide some sort of even surface that looks homogeneous or evenly laid out. And so to do that, what I've got here is an automatic center punch. An automatic center punch, basically you start pushing and you push to a point where if you heard that click, your hand will kind of dive in. And it more or less, as long as you provide a somewhat consistent input driving it into the wood, and I'll use this little scrap of wood as an indicator, it will provide a dot that's very similar. And you can see those three dots now that are very close. And so the idea is to not have any particular pattern or lines to it, to more or less make it random, yet fill the piece. I'm sorry, both hands are moving because I'm freehanding this. I'm not using the bench. So I thought I'd let you see it a little bit, or how I go about that on the wood. And so on a stock, I like to be able to roll it because I want the automatic center punch tool to be kind of perpendicular to the wood. Otherwise, it cuts a groove rather than cutting a round dot. Another thing I should mention, I've blunted this end and polished it over so it doesn't have a sharp point like one you would go to the store and buy. And I've also taken it apart and I've replaced the factory springs meant for using with aluminum and steels and hard metals. I replaced both of those springs with lighter springs so that obviously I don't need as much spring force to make the same size punch mark in wood as I do in steel. And so what I'll generally try to do is start working an area and just pretty wildly, still staying within enough control that I'm not going outside the boundaries. And this helps to kind of randomize the dot pattern a little bit and keep me from just going from one dot to the next and having a bunch of lines. And occasionally you're going to have some lines, maybe 3 or 4 dots in a row line up, but all you got to do is stick a dot, like these 3 dots here line up, stick a dot slightly off center to it, and it disrupts that pattern. And so we'll just keep doing this process until everything that is not a Lichtenberg trace is either stippled or contained within inside this border with stippling or Lichtenberg figure, and everything outside will be French polish, high gloss, like this end that has not been polished out yet. It's just been filled and a couple of coats on it for sanding it back. The fore end at this point is going to have the same thing done to it. but I'm going to use this black outline that I carved in with a wood burner, and I'll cut that back out with a grooving tool. I think I mentioned that earlier. So that's the process, and now it's just a matter of sitting down and punching away to my heart's content. It's usually best done in a recliner with good light from a side, so you get a nice shadow, and someplace where you can be patient, like a recliner watching television. You do have to pay attention to what you're doing here, so you can't just watch a movie and punch around and it gets done, but you can prioritize your concentration on this and then just kind of in the background halfway listen to what's going on and pass the time, because it will take several hours to do these. It took, of course, there's a lot of area on this, and by the way, this has got to be dulled down. It's way too shiny. I want more of a satin look to it, and so I'll do that with some gray or white Scotch-Brite and kind of knock some of that shininess off to give myself a little more contrast between this. Now, so then once that's done, I'll come in just like I did on the fore end, and I will tape off all the way to the cut groove, all the way around this area, and I'll finish this stock as normal for a French polish, and then I'll peel my masking tape and paper off, revealing this, and then I use, because this wood is pretty crushed up, it's going to be pretty soft and easily marrable and scratchable, and pieces come out of it, and so I use a wood hardener on it, and that will help preserve it and keep that from happening. It'll also preserve the Lichtenberg figures and harden them so those carbon bits don't come out of them. So the next time you see this, you should see either some level of progress completely filled in or the entire thing filled in, and that's where we're going to shoot for next. Okay, I thought I'd give an update on the stippling process. This side is fully stippled now. I'll go back in and maybe touch up a few areas. Let me bring that up if I can get it close and still maintain focus. And you can see the stippling, what it looks like as compared to checkering, for instance, or something else. And you can do that with something just as simple as a hammer and nail. I choose to use the center punch. It gives me a little control. I see a little spot, if I can get over here, right there, where that needs to be touched up a little bit and some more stippling added. It'll just take a few hours of kind of going over it, looking for those spots, and I'm getting ready to start laying out the border lines on this side. Now, this side, I've just started the stippling process, and so I've got kind of an outline of where the lines will go for the border, and then I've just started randomly stippling in the open areas to make sure I have a random effect and I don't have a bunch of lines drawn or circles drawn or something like that. Next step for this is to go in and do that detail work right up against the Lichtenberg figures and get that punch up right up against it without getting into the wood, and putting that little stippler up there right there against it all the way through, and then going back and filling in between. That's nowhere densely populated enough stippling wise, so there's still a lot more work to do on this side. So as you can see now, mostly just following along the lines of the Lichtenberg figures, the traces, has really filled out the pattern quite a bit. What looks to be pretty sparse down at the bottom where I haven't outlined the traces, where I have outlined the traces, starts to look pretty dense. And so we're getting a good filling in of that, and you just kind of go along and trace out each one of those It's going to be very, very difficult to show that on camera because my hand is in the way. You just basically put the point where you want the indent to be and press on the automatic center punch, and the center punch fires and leaves the dent behind. So it's just a matter of patience and filling in all the spots that don't have any stippling in them whatsoever. Well, here's a look at the finished stippling on the grip. There's a natural knot in this area here that was very, very hard and took 4 and 5 strikes sometimes to get a stipple to indent the material. There's a similar thing that grows. It must have been something that grew through that area of the wrist of the stock, and very, very hard material, whatever it was. But fairly consistent now in terms of stippling population. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with that area there. There's a little bit of stippling still has to happen there in the outer border area, but I want to get the border cut before I do that because that wood is so hard there. I don't want to be outside of the border with any stippling because it'll be impossible to recover from that. But that's what it looks like. And next up will be the actual cutting of the border. And I've got a couple of tools I use for that are basically checkering tools, and I'll use them to cut the border following mostly this outer line left over from the original Perazzi checkering. I kind of stippled up to it. In places I went over it because I liked the way the grain was flowing there, and it just seemed to be a better line. But for the most part I stayed within it. And as a reminder, this is the other side, and I'll do the same thing with it. Now back to, set that aside. If I can bring this in, I still have not put a satin finish on the stippling here, this shiny. I'm not particularly attracted to that, and I believe looking more of a matte finish will be much more attractive there and provide more contrast. On this one, I cut the border in completely by hand because all the Perazzi checkering was gone, because this used to be a beaver tail 4-in. It came out straight out here and then rounded, and so I cut this as a Schnabel 4-in, so I lost all the lines for all the checkering, and of course the checkering didn't come up the side like this. So all those lines were completely lost, and there was some thinning down of the 4-in. The original checkering was just a single diamond with a small diamond in the center that left undone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in that burned groove, and I'll use the checkering tool to remove all the carbon there to make a nice clean line like the grip will have. This, as you can see, still has to be sanded and the finish coat's applied, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This is on the grip and not on the 4-in. The 4-in is kind of a different series, but I don't think that burned in grip or burned in border would look nearly as attractive as just a cut border or a sharply distinguished border. I could do that with stippling, for instance, rather than cutting a groove, but I think in this case cutting the groove is going to be much better looking. So that said, now to having this stock finished, we'll pull, everything has to come apart of course, and then there's a little bit of work has to be done here where this outer shell, as it telescopes in and out, I don't know that it will, but it's possible it would rub. So I need to thin it down. And I don't like this little belly right here. I'm going to sharpen that transition up a little bit and make it a little cleaner rather than a shad belly, make it more of a step. And so that's what we've got. Please feel free to leave comments, and we'll continue the series until we're finished up with this stock and forend.